Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk. I'm Steve Yates, your host, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. Notice to our audience to remind you that you can watch episodes of the China Desk on YouTube, and please feel free to subscribe at Spotify, Apple, Google, any of your preferred podcast providers. We appreciate your subscription, engagement, and support. My guest today is Dr. Rob Spalding. He's former Brigadier General in the United States Air Force, former Senior Director for Strategic Planning in the White House National Security Council, and is currently CEO of Semper.ai. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through our conversation. But Rob also is the author of two outstanding books. One, War Without Rules, China's Playbook for Global Domination. The other, Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. So plenty out on our plates. Rob, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump into it. Rob, help me begin with the audience at the beginning. You are going about your career serving the country. I assume at some point along the way you got nudged to spend some time in the Middle Kingdom. And help me talk through the journeys that I think a lot of us who've come to a particular point of view on the nature of the CCP threat have had. We kind of were educated and trained in what I call the warm bath of conventional thinking about engagement with China. And somewhere along the way, we get mugged by reality. I was mugged. I'm pretty sure you were mugged. But talk us through a little bit about that entry journey.
Well, yeah, I probably was quite a bit more naive than you. And thanks for having me on, Steve.
Sure.
My introduction to China happened as a young major in the Air Force, and I got selected for a program called the Olmsted Scholar Program. And quite frankly, I didn't know, I couldn't tell you the first thing about China. I had an inkling that China would be strategic. I didn't know if that would be in a positive or a negative way, but I felt like, hey, this is something, if I was going to go overseas, if I was going to learn a foreign language, which the Olmsted Scholar Program requires you to, I thought, well, I should go to someplace that's strategic. And so I picked China, but I did not think I was going to get accepted. And so it was a surprise to me in April of 2001 when the Air Force said, hey, you're going off to China. Of course, it was a surprise to my wife, too. I didn't know, for instance, in the Olmsted Scholar Program, you have to go to a university. I didn't know that Fudan University was this great, university in China. And so I ended up going to a civil engineering college called Tongji University, just because that's how ignorant I was of China. But, I went to Defense Language Institute for a year. We lived in China, in Shanghai for 2 years, traveled the country. It was an amazing experience. And I came home from that, really in love with China, in love with the Chinese people. Of course, I stayed away from anything to do with the government because, I was a B-2 pilot living in China. So I would say that, I did leave with rose-colored glasses, and I wanted to go back. I thought it was, I was going to have this long career, having a relationship with China, either in the government or maybe later in the private sector. And that's what I told my wife. So my I guess awakening didn't happen until, it was almost 13 years later when I, was slated to go be the senior defense official, and I was working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the Pentagon as his China advisor. And I really started to dig into the competition there because I had received a presentation that had been produced by one of the top 5 audit agencies, given to me by a friend that was in Wall Street, and it really just changed my perspective. It got me to think of what China was doing, from an economic and financial perspective to the United States was very much like what we had done with B-2s in Kosovo in terms of, taking away assets of the elites. And this really, kind of changed my life and changed my perspective, and led to, of course, the books that you talk about, and even the business that I started. So it was a pretty dramatic shift from I love China, I have no idea that the Chinese Communist Party exists, to I still love China, I love the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist Party is, essentially an enemy, and we need to begin to look at it that way.
Yeah, I think that there's so many people that I talk to that have had somewhat of a similar journey. I think Americans have, at some deep level, an almost missionary-like impulse where we look out into the world and we see possibilities. We see potential converts to a positive sum way of living. And so we see opportunity, friendship, and there is a level of Chinese interaction, especially in the social level, that is very welcoming. People come together around food, around other kinds of gatherings. Hospitality is done to the nth degree in a lot of parts of life, and yes, a lot of us, say, hey, we'll study this language, study this culture, and it is tremendous. For me, a breaking point was sort of that aha moment where I realized, all of that is well and good, but the Communist Party literally conducted a revolution against all of that. And it's the enemy of that culture, that civilization, and those people. But then you get into government. You talk about 2001. That's a really interesting time for an Air Force official to be going to China because of the EP3 incident that happened in that year, and some uninvited guests on Hainan Island for a brief time. But boy, does time fly on that in that regard. But you dove into, once you had this awakening, you dove into a space, in my estimation, of China policy and China studies that really was underappreciated. You were looking at technology and information as a real high strategic priority. Most other thinking about China was sort of looking at where are the ships and the planes, how many what numbers of personnel and material. But China was, even by the 2010s, really aggressively moving in the direction of information warfare and technological warfare. But to talk a little bit about that period prior to the courtship that suckered you into going into the White House for a time, of what your key observations were about that sector. Am I right about this impression of that was really an emerging, important area, and it was underappreciated in the policy world, in the national security realm, but also academic and otherwise?
Well, I think one of the things that happened, after I read that report was I began to, construct a briefing that went to many of the senior leaders in the Department of Defense, a lot of the four-star combat commanders, certainly the vice chairman, the deputy secretary of defense, discussing, the implications of our relationship with China. And I think the first part that comes out of this is this idea that we need some way to analyze how, the implications for this relationship on our economy, on our industrial base. And so the first thing that came out of that was the stand up of something called the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis. And so, we got an office stood up in the Air Force Secretariat that actually focused on economic competition, from a research perspective. And specifically in the beginning, it was, hey, let's look at the impact of this relationship on key capabilities. One key capability that the United States has, for example, are jet engines. Okay, well, if I look out in the jet engine industry, what are those things that really differentiate the United States from China? And then what is our ability to protect those things from being acquired by China? So that's just one example of things that we were doing. I think the other thing that from a policy perspective, that people recognize is something called the DIUX report. Well, out of that, I essentially recruited Mike Brown to come into the department and write the DIUX report. Of course, he went on to lead DIU. Now, these are things that were happening, for the most part, from a Washington, D.C. perspective, under the radar, but they were nevertheless very important, because when I got to the White House as Senior Director for Strategic Planning, I was able to reach in and rely on the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, connect them to the U.S. Trade Representative, and they ended up doing a lot of the research that went into the Section 301 report. So these are, I think one of the things that the story here, the backstory, is that everybody thinks that people that are full-time in the bureaucracy aren't necessarily doing things to actually make things better. It's a deep state. We don't really care. Actually, there's a lot of people that do care, and there's a lot of people that do a lot of things. And by the time that you see it, there's been years of work that have gone on behind the scenes to put together the pieces, because Washington, D.C. doesn't move in a day. It moves over, months, over years, and you have to build the arguments. They have to be rock solid. You have to have your data, or else people just aren't going to move, particularly on something as important as the U.S. relationship with China. So we had to actually do the work and then walk into meetings and be prepared to back back the things that we were saying. And that's a lot of the stuff that I was doing, from my after I had the awakening.
Yeah. Well, it's a perfect pivot to talk a little bit about what some of that White House experience was. When you're talking about the National Security Council, they haven't always had a position of senior director for strategic planning on the National Security Council. In the Bush administration, there was a time when there was someone who would be brought in to fill somewhat that role from time to time, but it wasn't sort of on the org chart for each successive administration from, say, the Kissinger NSC forward. So that, I think, is an interesting window into how NSCs work. But in particular, when people think of the Trump administration, especially in that earlier phase of the administration, there was this pivot on China policy that was focused on economics and trade. There were tons of other things that were happening too, but there was a real emphasis on trying to rejuvenate America, protect American intellectual property, try to negotiate a better trade deal, impose some tariffs and other restrictions. There were the enforcement parts of the U.S. government that most people don't know about that are out there to look at export controls or sensitive technologies, things like that. But from the prep that you had in looking in this area and then coming into that position, what were some of the sort of key things you saw as moving the needle in the right direction in that early White House experience? And what were some of the areas you thought, well, shoot, now that I see things from the mountaintop, I really need to get out of here and get back out into the trenches, because now I can see more clearly where I need to marshal more forces and more arguments?
Well, I think one of the big things that you find, particularly in the Trump administration, when you come into the White House, everything is not as it seems. And, so let's go to your first contention about, and we call each office in the NSC pound something. So it's a hash in front of. So I was in pound strategy.
Yeah.
Typically, just about everybody that's assigned, and I was detailed, so I was owned by the military. I was detailed because the White House doesn't get a big budget to hire people just
Right.
off the street. They're getting them mostly from the interagency. So I was coming over from the Pentagon, and I went into pound strategy in the Trump administration. And what was interesting about that was we had a national security advisor who had a vision for strategy, and that was General Kelly. Well, by the time I got into office, he was gone. McMaster was in place, but that office remained. And so, as is usually the case, General McMaster wanted to bring in his own people. And so in this case, he brought in Nadia Shadlo. So she was writing the national security strategy, and I was still found myself as pound strategy. Now, every person at the National Security Council typically is handed a portfolio of issues to work. Well, in my case, I was not only a not functional and not regional office. Strategy kind of looks across functions, looks across regions. And the second, I wasn't in an office that was, an office that McMaster had built. So I was in a kind of the opposition force, if you will. And so that really gave me some freedom to think. And this was the original vision that General Kelly had for pound strategy, was to look long term, like look out across the United States, look out across the world, and really look cross functional and trans regional, and begin to make an opinion about how do we protect the long term viability of the republic. And so that's what we did. And so I did help Nadia, with the national security strategy, but we also looked at issues like strategic petroleum reserve. When should we fill up? What is that useful for? How do we leverage it? And because in a lot of cases, you find in Washington D.C. policies are made. I've seen literally policies decided over a 10-minute conversation that had huge impact, and we're not actually studying the long-term implications of things. So typically, as you know, there's second and third order effects that we don't anticipate. So that's what we were trying to do in Pound strategy. And that's really, in addition to the national security strategy, the thing that I worked on that took a lot of time and had me going and talking to people that I never talked to was, where is 5G going? What are the implications for the United States, and what should we do about it? And that paper ended up being leaked. Again, that leak was partially to attack the president. That's why things get leaked. But it was also partially to discredit work that I was doing that impacted, some believe, the telecom industry. And there is this war going on at all times in the executive branch, and that is a war between what do we need to do for national security and what do we need to do for the economy, and are they at cross purposes, or do they need to be linked? And my contention, and the contention that I had the entire time I was at the National Security Council, and even now, is that they have to be linked in this era of globalization and the internet, because they become vectors for countries like China and Russia and others to attack us, whether it's influencing our political process, whether it's taking intellectual property, whether it's decreasing our manufacturing so that we don't have the ability to rely on things that we need, or we're destroying the fabric of those small communities that used to house those factories. The implications really range across our society, our economy. And so these are things that we have to consider, not just, hey, how many F-35s do we have in inventory, but are we actually creating the type of, environment that Americans can thrive? Can they reach their true potential? Or can they reach the American dream? And it's not just a National Economic Council question. It's also a National Security Council question. And they actually need to work together. And what I found is that typically the National Economic Council saw the National Security Council as, hey, you have no place to really think about economic security as a question regarding national security. And that's where I think, we've gotten so far away from where we need to be.
Well, all of what you say has a haunting ring of familiarity. Those are some long-term contending kind of ways of thinking and institutional lanes. I'd like to believe that in this day and age, with post-COVID, post-spy balloon, post-fentanyl pouring over our borders, TikTok and whatever else is going on, that there's kind of an aggregation of issues that now it's too much for people to cover their eyes and hear no evil, see no evil, et cetera, et cetera. And we actually have a lot of conversations where people try to make the case actually that we can't look at China just as a national security issue. Economic security is national security. And the same could be said back the other way. You don't have national security, you're not going to have a thriving economy either. And then there's also the whole sort of culture and private sector element of it that's outside of government that sure is key. And as you know very well, the CCP goes after all of these things, not just one of them. They don't stay in their lane. But you talked about a little bit in the White House experience of 5G. And I remember some things along the lines looking at clean supply chains, clean networks. There was actually some progress made, hard sell for a time among allies about particular providers, particular technologies. And I remember a lot of shoe leather work being done by people to nurture that along. I think in 2023, we look back at that and we sort of take it as a given that makes some sense. I think COVID maybe has made people awaken a little bit more toward the vulnerabilities on strategic supply chains. I don't know if my hope is leading my thought too much in that regard. But really, as we go from that White House experience into your books and what you're doing in the private sector, I look at your body of work as really educating and sort of force multiplying for the public, and especially out in the private sector, not forgetting what the government needs to do in policy, but really doing the spade work, the real building the foundations from the grassroots up and out in the private sector, so that we have a resilient America that can handle these kinds of challenges. We can't wait for everyone to understand what the CCP is like. Not everyone's going to be able to go and see things, China, good and bad. Not everyone's going to have a personal experience where they see some kind of an atrocity that they can't unsee, and therefore their mind has changed. But they can become aware of, what? There are certain elements of American life that need to be resilient, and we need to have a degree of independence. We talk about energy independence. I would argue that food independence is just as important in that regard, but definitely in technology. When people in this day and age are talking about Taiwan contingencies and spy cameras on port cranes and other kinds of things, it's pretty obvious that the CCP and its tentacles are more deeply embedded into America's way of life than the Soviets could ever have imagined, that Al-Qaeda and its ilk ever could have imagined. And yet, it is arguably, I would say, the most murderous and ruthless regime mankind has ever known. There's the sheer number of people affected negatively to the point of death. I think the CCP's got the Guinness Book of World Record entry there. But so talk a little bit about the pivot out of the White House into your policy advocacy and education through the books. I guess it was Stealth War that came first, right?
Right, it was. And Stealth War was written for the American people. It was, and what I was trying to convey were all these things that I had learned over, the prior, almost 10 years of studying this issue and being involved in the policy making behind it. And I wanted it to be, be done in a way that people could read it very quickly. They could grasp the concepts, and then they could understand the implications. Because once you do that, at least for me, as I became awakened to the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party, it was much easier for me then to draw connections between things that I saw out in the world and how that was being influenced by this really bad relationship for the United States. So that came out in April of 2019, which was October 2019. It was done in terms of the writing in April of 2019. So only 4 months after I'd left, the book was written, and I had a fantastic co-author or co-writer that helped me phrase that in ways I wouldn't call myself a great writer. And so what I did was try to articulate, and then it's turned into what I think has turned out to be a very entertaining book, but also very informative. And so that was the first book. The second book really was kind of an outgrowth of the first, and it was always designed to be something more for policy people, to get a little bit deeper into the psyche of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly as it pertains to their brand of warfare. And so the way I did that was to take unrestricted warfare, which is somewhat well known in the policy community as a lot of people call it a strategy document for the Chinese military. In reality, it's not a strategy document; it's a doctrine document. And doctrine, really for the military is about those principles that you use to guide you in planning campaigns and wars. And so they were trying to create a guide that policymakers in the Chinese Communist Party could use in thinking about how to leverage their society to achieve the outcomes. Because, and it's much more about political warfare than it is about anything else. And of course, politics kind of, in human society, politics kind of is just about everywhere that you look. And so, they were using the two trends that they saw, and it was written in 1997, of globalization, the internet. And you think about 1997, what were you doing then? Did you not have an iPhone? No. Like I had a big fat PC with like a 9600 baud modem. I remember
Yeah.
getting on the first Google the first time around that time. The internet was very nascent. But these concepts that you see in TikTok, that you see in social media, that you see in the way China has rolled out the social credit score, they were embedded in this doctrine document. And so the first time I read it, Unrestricted Warfare in 1999, when it was translated by the CIA, I kind of discounted it because it was so far fetched. But the second time I looked at it, when I was in the Pentagon advising the chairman, I realized, oh my gosh, these guys were so prescient. They had seen into the future. They had seen where these technologies could potentially go, and then they had anticipated in what ways the Chinese Communist Party could use them to really change the world in their image. And quite frankly, if you look at those words, and then you look back across the decades where they became part of the WTO and all of these international institutions, and how we brought them in and gave them technology, talent, and capital, you can see that they've fully realized the vision that's in this doctrine document. So those are the two books that, one for the American people, I thought they needed to know. And of course, I do a lot of speaking engagements because I think it's important. I couldn't do that as a military member. And so thinking about my time as a B-2 pilot, what can I affect in a competition or a conflict or a confrontation with another entity that is primarily political in nature, that's not military in nature? How do I make a dent in that as a military officer? You can't. Your silence, your voice, and your voice is really the narrative, and how you're able to contribute to the narrative is so important in political warfare. And so I felt like I couldn't contribute anymore as a government officer. I needed to get out in the private sector so I could say what I want. I remember the first thing that I did the day after I retired, I picked up my phone and started tweeting, and it was like, it was my release. It was my way to. I felt like I had been restricted from fighting. It's almost like, you think about the guys that were flying in Vietnam when they had surface-to-air missile sites that they couldn't bomb, by policy, and so they're sitting there getting shot by these things, and they can't go after them. It was the same kind of feeling for me. Obviously, I wasn't in any mortal danger, but this idea that I needed to get out there and start talking about these things that I had learned, because I felt like I couldn't fight back. You can't fight back in uniform when you're talking about political warfare, because you're supposed to stay silent and apolitical. So that was my coming out. And we can certainly get into the private sector stuff. That's a whole different story.
Yeah, well, certainly what you've talked about in political warfare is something that's very, very important to me. It's important to some of our mutual friends, but I think it's one of the major missed lessons in China policy studies generally, that the Communist Party of China is primarily a political organization, and its number one go-to form of warfare, manipulation, control is politics first, and politics before everything else. And for much of our history of this period of attempted détente and engagement, but then competition and some elements of conflict, Americans, you think, would, with our entrepreneurial spirit, our free minds and free speech, ought to excel in this area. But insanely, to me, it seems like we've left our strength on the sidelines to a degree, sort of left it to the experts, left it to the diplomats. And I think it's extremely important that we have people with real life experience in government, out of government, in the private sector, what have you, to lean into these topics and engage the conversation. Because I think actually we're quite good at this if we can focus and organize. But what the Chinese Communist Party does very, very well is try to sow division and doubt and to compromise people. And they win not by firing shots, but by doing all of these elements of political warfare that we've sort of left on the shelf. So I applaud your jumping into that area. And I hope that the people who watch and listen will jump into the books and understand this. You and I have a mutual friend, Christian Whiten, who wrote a book that focuses on this political warfare as a core concept that is underutilized. And I hope the people who are contending to be the future leaders of the free world will lean into this as well. Let's pivot just a moment. And I want to talk about the private sector stuff as we kind of wind into our close. But before we get there, since you've laid a really solid foundation for the nature of this struggle and our own personal awareness going through these policies issues, we've got some big issues today. I'd like to get sort of your take on how we're doing as a country, what ideas need to get sort of framed and elevated better. We have a new Congress. Our committees of jurisdiction are sort of taking another bite at the apple a little differently. We have a new select committee on the Chinese Communist Party. There are things it can do, but then there's things it probably can't do. As a country, we're going to go through a prolonged presidential election again. Who knows where all that goes? But as you look at it, what do you see as kind of the top areas of policy opportunity where things could be done in the states or the Congress, or maybe, who knows, there's a bridge that can be connected with the Biden administration and something positive moves forward right now?
Yeah, well, selfishly, I'm just going to start with infrastructure. I think we need digital infrastructure that is, for the most part, indestructible. We saw during the Tennessee bombing down in Nashville 2 Christmases ago, where the state's communication was taken out for 2 weeks by a single bomber on a single building. Look at Katrina or other hurricanes, and then the potential of an EMP. So I'm focused on hardening critical infrastructure because I think that's very important. But in terms of 2 things that I would say that are really something that we need to get after. One is manufacturing, and I mean manufacturing. No kidding, bringing back the capability to build our own things. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, we don't want to have to, look across the ocean and say, hey, China's just invaded Taiwan. Where are we going to get our antibiotics? Because they've cut us off. So we want to be able to make the things that the country actually needs. And then secondly, the implications for those communities, those tens of thousands of communities where those manufacturing jobs left, they have been left decimated. So now you start to create this resurgence of the American dream, this ability to, have economic prosperity and to really, go out and do the things that you want to do to achieve your dreams. When I back in 2019, I had the opportunity to go to a factory in Pennsylvania that had been shut down. It was a furniture factory, and overnight it was shut down, and it was primarily from pressure from Chinese manufacturers. And you got to talk to the people there, and they're like, been there 30 years, 35 years. What are they going to do? And this factory was the major employer for that small county in Pennsylvania. So this has happened in community after community. So it's not just about making the things that make us what we need, but also making our communities whole. I think that, so actually focusing on that, not giving lip service to it, not just saying, oh, it's a private sector, but actually using things like the Defense Production Act and Title III to force that manufacturing back on shore. I think it helps in both of those ways. And, finally, I think, understanding the implications of China being coupled with the United States, how they're able to use our corporations and financial institutions and academic institutions to influence our political process is something that there cannot be this, hey, we have areas of cooperation and competition. No, China sees them all as areas of war, and they are going to leverage every connection they have to us, whether it be social or academic or political or economic or financial. All of those they see as vectors for attack. And so we have to get them out of our system. And this is what we did with the Soviet Union. We said, you guys go over there and you have your economic system, and you see how that works. And how it worked is it collapsed. And China is able to basically paper over the problems that the Soviet Union had because they have the ability to pull capital and pull technology and pull talent out of the West. And as long as they have that, and at the same time use those same vectors to influence the political process. We have companies, American companies, trying to influence Washington, D.C. on the chip CHIPS Act or on CFIUS reform, right? They're trying to basically say, no, we need to continue to have these connections to China because we want to sell them stuff, or we want to get their investment, or, it's good for business. It'll prevent conflict. It's all talking points of the Chinese Communist Party that get injected into Congress, not from China, but from the business community. So decoupling, bringing back manufacturing, and then hardening our infrastructure, particularly our digital infrastructure, our communications, is the three things that I say are really, really, if we could do those three things, that'd go a long way to healing what ails us. Now, that decoupling from China, it also has a second component that if our allies and partners are coupled with China, then they're not allies and partners. And so we need to make sure and very clear to our allies and partners that want to be actual allies and partners that decoupling has to happen for their side as well. Otherwise, they can't, receive defense. They can't expect the United States to defend them, and they certainly can't trade, in the same way that a society that decides to isolate themselves from the Chinese Communist Party would be able to.
Well, I'd say amen to all of that. And just to add virtue on top of it, this is basically what the Chinese Communist Party is already doing for itself. They're engaging in strategic decoupling. And somewhere along the lines, Americans forgot about the golden rule or reciprocity. And so if we can't buy ag land in China, they shouldn't be able to buy ag land here. And if we can't set up our own independent companies over there and keep politics out of it, well, we shouldn't be letting them come over here. We certainly shouldn't be bending the rules to give them privileged access. I think among the greatest sins we committed in the era of engagement was allowing them to abide by a different set of rules. They were not transparent, didn't have the same accounting requirements as other kinds of firms. They were able to list in our markets. They're able to hide who their investors were and what their political ties were. And so, the rules of transparency and accountability we impose on ourselves, our leaders, and our allies, we somehow gave a pass. And for all of its august number of years in power, the Communist Party of China hasn't invented a single thing of value to humanity or to its own people. Everything that has modernized China came from the free world. The money, the technology, the opportunity and access. And you got to believe that this decoupling thing, our friend Bob Lighthizer talks about strategic decoupling because it does need to be prioritized and strategic and probably can't happen overnight. But we got to move, and we got to at least move in those priority areas. But my goodness, I hope people are right there with us at this being an important priority. Now, I also see it happening somewhat in the states. We talk a lot about the federal government, what's happening with the administration and Congress, and that sure is important. But I see the battle in South Dakota where Governor Noem was trying to put forward a CFIUS-like process to block the CCP from getting farmland, but it was really also with an eye towards national security generally. I mean, the federal government can't cover everything in an accountable and effective way. And so having the states do some of these things, I think, is actually constructive, important, and it follows the principle of federalism. But it's bringing the conversation out to people where hopefully they can engage and meet with greater success. I mean, you go up to Capitol Hill and a well-heeled and well-funded lobbyist sometimes can block and tackle pretty darn well. But you get out into the state capitals, everybody knows each other. Maybe there's a better conversation to be had. But Rob, before I run out of time, I want to talk a little bit about your private sector work and how it relates to the policy and sort of strategic stuff that we've been talking about through this conversation. You're out there doing the spade work in the private sector, an area that I think is super important. We alluded to the 5G and clean networks and the importance of resilience and the tech space. Why don't you share a little bit about what Semper AI is and does, and how it is this outgrowth of what you were doing before?
Well, what's funny, that paper that got leaked to the media that I wrote when I was at the White House, it was actually a draft. It wasn't the actual final paper. I'd be embarrassed to see some of the typos that were in there. And there was actually even a comment from Nokia, because I'd actually elicited, comments from industry. But if you look at that paper, you really see the essence of what Semper is. And that is this idea that Now that 5G has driven almost the entire architecture of cellular communications into software that can run on commercial off-the-shelf servers, that we can begin to think differently about architecture. The reason we had a failure in Tennessee when the AT&T switching center was bombed is because we have a highly centralized infrastructure today. And so the idea was to build hardened, decentralized infrastructure nodes that will allow you to have resiliency and security in those locations where you needed it most. And then to tie those together via satellite to enable you to have an international communication system if you began to connect these things together. But, we start with locations where are those places that you want to make sure that the lights never go out in terms of communications. Your iPhone will, or your Android phone will continue to work even if you have a grid failure or power failure. Obviously you can think of plenty of government operations and continuity of government, continuity of operations that need that, but there's also things like energy and transportation and water, first responders, telecommunications, all of these things. There are areas where you need to have this resiliency and security, and that's the areas that Semper is focused on. Now, I think what's super exciting about Semper is it's primarily an edge processing company based on the original architecture as devised by Seymour Cray. And so our hardware is actually, the legacy goes back to his original design for a supercomputer, and basically shrinks that down and applies it to telecommunications and edge processing. So, we have primarily been building nodes that rely on commercial off-the-shelf equipment, whether it be, Ericsson, Nokia, or, regular servers that you can buy anywhere. But this next version of our node is really going to be a game changer, because it's going to be the embodiment of all the architecture and thinking that we put in over this, over 4 years that we've been in business. So, we're getting progressively smaller and faster and more secure and more resilient as time goes on. And so when you think about people that are doing technology work in the telecommunication space, it's always about, how do we make this cat video play that much faster? Ours is about how do we make those SCADA systems more secure? How do we take, live streaming video and turn that into AI, information that we can use to alert us that somebody's fallen, or somebody's had a break in, or somebody's had some kind of issue where somebody needs to be alerted. Maybe that's in an area that's isolated and austere, and we need the ability to know that right now. Well, that's what Semper is about bringing that intelligence so you can use it right now, and having the resilience and the security and the confidence to know that no matter what happens, this thing's going to be up and running. Everything else could go out, and your phone, if you're near one of these things, is going to continue to keep you connected both locally and via satellite distantly. So that's the exciting thing. I think this 5G gave us all these opportunities. Even Huawei is not doing the things that I'm talking about. They are doing things, but they're not doing it in the way that. So again, I thought, hey, American innovation could be the way that we, pull ourselves out of the competition here and showed something different. And I do think in the areas of security and resiliency, and particular data security and privacy, which I think is where we need to differentiate ourselves from China, who wants everybody's data. I think that's where America can shine and really. And when that happens, we can actually put in place the protections for privacy and security that a democracy needs. We do not want a world where either the tech companies or our government has total control and access to our data. We want to be able to hold that sacred and continue to keep our privacy, even in a world where we can have cameras that notice everything you do. We don't want that to turn into, hey, I'm going to use that to control you. I want to use that to help you have a better life, but have a better life in the way that our Constitution intends.
Well, I love everything that you've been able to share in our conversation today, Rob. It's a wonderful example to be able to highlight someone who served the country in multiple different ways. You're out there and serving in the private sector in a way that hopefully is profitable, but also has a lot of purpose to it. So I just want to thank you for what you're doing and spending your time with us today. For our audience, thank you for joining. If you liked what you saw and heard today, please tell your friends, and please consider subscribing. Until next time, I would say thank you here from the China desk, and a special thank you to Rob Spalding for sharing his perspective today. So look forward to our next conversation here at the China desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.